Bob Menendez. Bob Menendez was once the kind of senator you didn't question. Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a power broker in Washington, a man with access to classified briefings and foreign leaders on speed dial. But behind the polished persona was a crumbling empire of greed, and the fall was as cinematic as it was disgraceful. When federal agents raided his New Jersey home in 2023, they weren't just looking for paperwork. What they found looked like the plot of a political thriller gone rogue. Envelopes of cash stuffed in jacket pockets, a luxury car in the driveway, and gold bars, yes, actual gold bars, hidden in closets like pirate treasure. But it wasn't just the brazen display of wealth that stunned the nation, it was who he was allegedly helping. Prosecutors accused Menendez of acting as a secret foreign agent for Egypt, marking the first time in U.S. history a sitting senator was indicted on such a charge. He wasn't just pocketing bribes. He was accused of leaking sensitive government info to benefit a foreign regime. And just when it couldn't get messier, enter Nadine Menendez, his wife, his alleged partner in crime, and according to prosecutors, the go-between who helped deliver messages and seal shady deals. Her conviction added a toxic dose of betrayal to an already damning saga. Together, they weren't just a power couple. They were allegedly a criminal enterprise with access to the halls of government and no apparent shame in selling out their country for gold, cash, and favors. In July 2024, the jury found Menendez guilty on all 16 counts. By January 2025, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, a titan of foreign policy reduced to a cautionary tale, the kind of downfall that sends a chill through every marble corridor on Capitol Hill. Dean Tran. Dean Tran didn't just bend the rules, he shredded them, rewrote them in invisible ink, and handed them to his sister to co-sign. Once hailed as a trailblazer, the first Vietnamese American elected to the Massachusetts State Senate, Tran's rise was historic. But behind the scenes, his political career was quietly rotting. In 2020, red flags started waving when the Senate Ethics Committee caught Tran using his taxpayer-funded staff as his personal campaign army during office hours. That alone was enough to knock him down a peg. But Tran wasn't done, not even close. After leaving office in 2021, he pulled a scheme so brazen it sounded like a bad TV plot. While collecting checks from a pandemic unemployment program meant for the jobless, Tran was secretly pulling in over $30,000 as a paid consultant. To cover his tracks, he and his sister Tuit Martin whipped up a backdated fake job offer letter to make it seem like he wasn't working at the time. It was a dirty paper trail, deliberately designed to fool investigators, and they almost got away with it. But Tran's lies didn't stop at forged paperwork. He conveniently forgot to mention over $54,000 in consulting income and rental money on his tax returns. It wasn't just sloppy accounting, it was calculated deceit, aimed at squeezing every drop he could from both the public and private sectors. Eventually, the house of cards collapsed. In September 2024, Tran was hit with 20 counts of wire fraud and multiple tax charges. His sentencing in February 2025 included prison time, restitution, and supervised release. But the real kicker, even as he was going down, Tran's sister got dragged into the mud, facing charges of obstruction and lying to a grand jury. A family affair of fraud, built on lies, and funded by the very system they pretended to serve. Carlos Uresti. Carlos Uresti wasn't just a Texas state senator, he was a smooth-talking charmer who knew how to play the long game. With his sharp suits, practiced grin, and endless talk about veterans and child advocacy, Uresti built a political brand rooted in trust. But behind that polished facade was a man running a con so cold-blooded it wrecked lives, including one grieving mother who had already suffered more than most could bear. Denise Cantu lost her children in a car crash. When she received a settlement of nearly $1 million, she trusted Uresti, her former attorney, to help her invest it wisely. Instead, he funneled her into a fake oil business. Four Winds Logistics, which turned out to be a Ponzi scheme drenched in fraud and fantasy. Uresti wasn't some innocent bystander. He collected six-figure consulting fees, used his political clout to recruit victims, and even flashed his Senate letterhead to give the scam credibility. Investors thought they were buying into fracking sand deals. What they were really funding was a fraud-fueled joyride, luxury cars, private events, high-end salaries, and hush money to keep the pyramid from crumbling. When the scam finally unraveled, the damage was staggering: lives ruined, trust shattered, and millions gone. The courtroom turned into a theater of betrayal. Denise Cantu sat just feet away from the man who took her children's death settlement and torched it for profit. Prosecutors laid it all bare, emails, payments, contracts dripping with deceit. And when the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, it wasn't just Uresti who fell, it was the myth that public service still meant public good. Carlos Uresti's name is now a cautionary tale, a politician who didn't just break the law, he broke the hearts of the very people who needed him most. Raymond Holmberg. For decades, Raymond Holmberg was the untouchable giant of North Dakota politics, an elder statesman who shaped budgets, led committees, and earned a reputation as a calm, collected educator turned lawmaker. He served in the state Senate for nearly 50 years and chaired the Senate Appropriations Committee, like a man born for power. To colleagues, he was Ray, the principled voice of experience. To constituents, he was the teacher who made good. But behind that grandfatherly facade lurked one of the darkest secrets ever uncovered in American political life. Holmberg wasn't just traveling abroad on harmless cultural exchanges. He took nearly 14 trips to Prague over the span of a decade, using the alias Sean Evans to cloak his identity. These weren't sightseeing adventures. These were predatory missions. Federal investigators discovered that Holmberg used these trips to engage in illicit activities with underage boys, acts arranged through a brothel infamous for its exploitation of minors. What's worse, he manipulated a 16-year-old Canadian boy online, posing as a peer to solicit explicit images, sickening behavior for any man, let alone a state senator and former school counselor. It all unraveled after a separate investigation into a known offender revealed disturbing text exchanges with Holmberg. A search of his home turned up digital evidence that told a horrifying story. The fallout was swift and brutal. Holmberg resigned, his teaching license was revoked, and even the North Dakota School Boards Association scrambled to claw back over $140,000 used to fund some of his trips. In March 2025, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, with the judge openly condemning his crimes as very vile, very sickening behavior. A legacy built over half a century evaporated in seconds, and what was left behind was nothing but disgrace, disgust, and a state struggling to process the betrayal. Dean Skelos. Dean Skelos didn't just sell out his office, he did it for his son. Once the powerful majority leader of the New York State Senate, Skelos used his influence like a personal ATM to pad his son's pockets. While other lawmakers pushed legislation for the people, Skelos was orchestrating a bribery pipeline behind the scenes, bullying companies with business before the state into handing over cushy contracts and no-show jobs to his son Adam. From 2011 to 2015, the duo schemed their way into over $300,000 in corrupt payouts, with Skelos trading political favors for private kickbacks. One real estate firm, Glenwood Management, coughed up a fat $20,000 and hooked Adam up with a consulting gig, just in time for Skelos to conveniently grease legislation in their favor. Another company handed Adam a gig he didn't earn while Skelos pushed through a $12 million contract for them. But their arrogance caught up to them. In 2015, the FBI pounced. Both father and son were hit with federal corruption charges and convicted. But in a wild twist, their convictions were tossed in 2017 after a Supreme Court ruling narrowed the definition of public corruption. Most would have slithered away quietly. Not these two. They went back to court in 2018 and got slammed again, convicted on all counts. This time there was no escape. Dean got 4 years, Adam got just under that, and the judge scorched them for their lies and lack of remorse. The man once hailed as one of New York's most powerful lawmakers ended up in prison, his legacy obliterated not by political enemies, but by his blind devotion to a son who couldn't land a job without daddy shaking down the system. It wasn't just corruption, it was nepotism dipped in bribery and served with a side of arrogance. John Sampson. John Sampson wasn't just another suit in the New York State Senate, he was a gatekeeper. A polished, commanding presence from Brooklyn, once hailed as a rising star. But what the public didn't see was the shadowy double life he was leading, one where escrow accounts became piggy banks, and power became a tool for self-preservation. As a court-appointed referee in real estate foreclosures, Sampson was entrusted with holding money meant for others. But from 1998 to 2008, he quietly siphoned over $440,000 from an escrow account under his control. This wasn't some sloppy bookkeeping error, it was a decade-long betrayal baked into the system. He used the stolen cash to fund campaign expenses and personal luxuries, never thinking he'd be caught. And maybe he wouldn't have, if he hadn't tried to outsmart the feds. When word spread of a broader corruption probe in Brooklyn real estate, Sampson panicked. But instead of coming clean, he doubled down. He reached out to a longtime associate in the U.S. Attorney's Office, hoping to score insider info on the investigation. What he didn't know, that associate was already cooperating. Every whisper, every desperate plea was recorded, solid gold wiretap evidence that turned his defense into dust. Sampson didn't just embezzle, he tried to rig the justice system from the inside. Brooklyn voters who once saw him as a symbol of upward mobility watched in disbelief as the mask slipped. What was once pride turned into anger and betrayal. In 2015, Sampson was convicted of obstruction of justice and making false statements. The image of a clean-cut leader collapsed into the reality of a man who used public trust as a smokescreen for theft and lies. And in the end, it wasn't a rival or a scandal that took him down, it was his own voice on tape. Harrison Williams. Harrison Williams built his reputation as a champion of the working class, a progressive titan who fought for union rights and helped push through legislation like the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. But the same man who promised to protect blue-collar workers would ultimately sell out their trust for a slice of an imaginary titanium mine. In the late 1970s, the FBI launched Abscam, a sting operation disguised as a wealthy Arab investment firm. Their bait, fake business deals in exchange for political favors. Williams didn't just nibble, he dove in head first. On hidden cameras, he confidently promised to secure government contracts and regulatory breaks in return for a future payday from a mine that didn't even exist. No sacks of cash were needed, just the illusion of power and profit. The irony, a man who dedicated decades to protecting workers threw it all away chasing phantom stocks. His conviction in 1981 made him the first senator in 80 years to be found guilty of crimes in office. He didn't just betray the law, he betrayed every laborer who believed he was one of them. The only thing real in his titanium dream was the downfall. Harrison Williams wasn't caught taking a bribe, he was caught selling out his soul. David Durenberger. David Durenberger's scandal didn't explode with wiretaps or FBI raids, it crept in like a quiet rot, subtle and calculated. While other senators fell from grace in a blaze of headlines, Durenberger's disgrace was the kind that whispered through the halls of Congress, staining reputations in hushed tones. At the core was a book deal that looked innocent on the surface, a series of paid promotional appearances. But under the hood, it was a carefully structured scheme to sidestep federal limits on outside income. Over $100,000 was funneled his way through stipends masked as speaking fees, a financial sleight of hand that violated Senate rules. And it didn't stop there. Durenberger also billed taxpayers for stays in his own condo, pocketing nearly $40,000 in reimbursements. He turned public office into a personal ATM, quietly, methodically, and with the kind of calm confidence only a career politician could muster. In 1990, the Senate voted unanimously to censure him, a rare humiliating rebuke. But the real kicker, after pleading guilty to criminal charges tied to false reimbursement claims, Durenberger went on to reinvent himself as a healthcare policy leader and advocate for ethical governance. He chaired think tanks, lectured about bipartisanship, and wrote a book titled When Republicans Were Progressive. The irony is almost poetic. A man who once bent rules for profit, now preaching about values, integrity and political unity. His scandal may have been quieter than others, but make no mistake, it was every bit as corrupt. Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens was a political titan in Alaska, a World War II pilot turned U.S. Senator. He ruled the Senate Appropriations Committee like a monarch with a blank check. For decades, he funneled billions into Alaskan infrastructure, earning the nickname Uncle Ted and the unwavering loyalty of his constituents. But that legacy unraveled over something almost laughably mundane, a cabin renovation in the remote ski town of Girdwood. The scandal, prosecutors claimed Stevens failed to disclose over $250,000 in upgrades paid for by an oil company exec, including plumbing, electrical work and carpentry. Stevens insisted he paid every bill presented to him, but that didn't stop the federal government from pouncing. In 2008, just weeks before his re-election bid, Stevens was indicted on 7 felony counts of failing to report gifts. The trial was rushed.
The evidence shaky, yet the jury convicted him. That verdict cost Stevens everything: his Senate seat, his reputation, and the respect he'd earned over 4 decades. But the twist: just months later, it was revealed that federal prosecutors had withheld critical exculpatory evidence that could have cleared his name. The conviction was thrown out too late. The damage had already detonated his career, and in a tragic final blow, Stevens died in a plane crash in 2010, never fully vindicated in the eyes of the public. His cabin may have been remodeled, but the cost wasn't just legal. It was the obliteration of a legacy built on service, sunk by sloppy justice and a media frenzy hungry for blood.